Some factories disappeared and were almost completely forgotten. But some people stay silent for a long time, while the things they make are still alive in everyday life. Somewhere in America, someone is still cooking with a skillet that was made nearly a century ago. And today, what was once just an ordinary object in an ordinary kitchen can now be valued at as much as $9,750. A company that once made everyday cookware for the American kitchen left behind objects that time has not easily erased. So what was it that turned an iron foundry in Erie, Pennsylvania into a name people still search for decades after its production lines had already stopped? But behind the skillets that still survive today lies a much larger question. A system that was built to last for a very long time could not keep going and gradually disappeared. This is the story of the silent Griswold factory. In the second half of the 19th century, America was changing very quickly. Railroads were pulling production regions closer together. Water routes were opening goods to far greater distances. Cities that could receive raw materials, organize labor, and send products outward began to take on a new role. They were no longer just places of trade. They were becoming places where industrial power accumulated day by day. Erie, Pennsylvania was one of those places. Set on Lake Erie and connected to both water and rail networks, the city had the conditions that allowed a small workshop not just to survive, but to grow alongside the expansion of American industry itself. Scale did not appear in a single moment. It formed in layers, from geography, from the movement of goods, from skilled labor, gradually hardening into manufacturing capacity. In 1865, Matthew Griswold and the Selden family laid the first foundation of their business in Erie. But at that point, the name was not yet associated with the kitchen. What first brought them success was hardware, especially hinges and small metal parts, the kinds of objects that drew little attention but demanded a very high degree of precision. The company did not grow into scale simply by selling the right product at the right time. It made ordinary goods with enough consistency that buyers could rely on them again and again. The molds were controlled. Tolerances were kept within limits. Uniformity was maintained from one batch to the next. And the finishing was done well enough that quality was not only a matter of function, but something visible in the feel of the object itself. This was no longer the story of a single craft shop. It was already the thinking of a system. This was where the core of Griswold began to take shape, not in the form of a standout product, but in something far quieter: manufacturing discipline, repeatable quality, the ability to turn precision into an operating habit. In industry, that kind of capability can open the way to almost everything that comes after. As America continued to urbanize in the final decades of the 19th century, the household kitchen was changing too. The need was no longer simply for something that could cook food, but for something that could withstand fire, withstand time, and withstand the repeated rhythm of daily use. For a company already fluent in the logic of metal molds and consistency, moving into cookware was not a random turn. It was almost a natural extension of the capabilities it had been building from the beginning. So when Griswold moved into skillets, pots, waffle irons, and other kitchen goods in the decades that followed, it did not enter that market as a name-chasing luck. It entered with a foundation. Not everyone had a system that already understood that reputation is not created at the moment of sale, but much earlier inside the foundry in places the buyer never sees. The quietest foundations are often the ones that build the most durable empires. But there is a great distance between a workshop that does good work and a manufacturing empire. So how did Griswold turn that foundation into power at scale? After its early years under the name Selden and Griswold, the company gradually separated from its original structure. In 1884, Matthew Griswold bought out the Selden family's interest. A year later, the old factory burned. But instead of bringing production to an end, the fire became a point of redirection. By 1887, the business had been reorganized under the name Griswold Manufacturing Company. From that point on, Griswold was no longer simply casting good products. Griswold began standardizing the way those products were made, identified, and brought to market. Skillets, Dutch ovens, waffle irons, and other cookware were no longer just separate goods. They were placed inside a common logic cast from more consistent molds, finished with greater care marked more clearly, and presented to buyers as parts of the same standard. That was a major difference between a company that knew how to make cast iron goods and a company that was building a brand through the quality of those goods. Griswold did not stand out by creating something unfamiliar. It was not the inventor of cast iron cookware. What Griswold did better than many of its competitors was turn care into a quality. The buyer could actually feel smoother, finishing a firmer feel in the hand, greater consistency from one piece to the next. In a market where most customers never saw the inside of a foundry, those things became the clearest language of quality. And once that had been repeated for long enough, another shift began to take shape. People no longer remembered only the object they had bought. They began to remember the name of the place that had made it. The Griswold name became more visible on the product itself. The logo became a mark of recognition. Catalogs meant the products were no longer seen as isolated kitchen tools, but as part of an ordered world of goods, deliberate, recognizable, and speaking in its own language. A skillet was no longer just a skillet. It was part of the system. Griswold was building a system of manufacturing identity and distribution at the same time. By the early 20th century, that scale continued to expand. In 1903, the company moved to a new facility at the corner of 12th and Raspberry Streets in Erie. The move to a new factory site did not simply reflect a need for more space. It showed that the system had grown large enough to require a different setting in order to maintain its own operating rhythm. More stages of production, more workers, more products. While still preserving the sense of consistency the market had come to recognize. Its products moved far beyond Erie. They appeared in catalogs in stores and household kitchens, in the everyday rhythm of an America moving deeper into mass consumption. From the late 19th century into the early 20th, Griswold was not only expanding production, Griswold was expanding its presence in daily life. Each part of the system was beginning to lock into place: the foundry, the finishing, the identifying marks, the catalogs, the distribution, and finally the habits of the people using the products. Once those parts had been working together for long enough with enough stability, a company no longer simply sold goods. It began to shape the standard of the very market it served. And for many decades, Griswold lived in that position. But the more beautifully a system works at its peak, the harder it becomes to accept changes that no longer follow the logic that built it. For much of the early 20th century, Griswold lived in the phase every manufacturer hopes to reach the point at which quality is no longer a promise, but a reputation. It was not just a few standout products. Griswold created an entire world of goods that could enter the household kitchen in many different forms: skillets, Dutch ovens, waffle irons, cast iron lids, molds, and then gradually newer product lines as the market changed. By the late 19th century, Griswold had already added aluminum cookware. In the 1920s came enamel lines. By the 1930s, the company had even moved into electric household appliances. By then, Griswold was no longer a workshop tied to a narrow group of products. It had become a company capable of scaling outward without losing its manufacturing identity. Customers did not turn to Griswold simply because it offered many products. They turned to Griswold because they knew whatever they bought would be made to a standard. Each object still carried the same qualities: solidity in the hand, careful finishing consistency, and a kind of trust built through standardized processes maintained over a very long time. Griswold occupied space in the market. More than that, Griswold occupied space in the daily habits of the American kitchen. In those years, the system was operating in something close to its ideal form. Production strong enough to sustain its reputation, brand recognition clear enough for buyers to remember the name, a product range broad enough to move deeper into daily life, and a distribution network strong enough to carry everything far beyond Erie. Many companies could sell products. Not many could create a presence in the kitchen, almost as a natural fact of everyday life. But it was precisely there that a paradox of success began to emerge. Objects made too well do not leave their users very quickly. People keep them. They use them for longer. That helps a reputation last. But from another angle, it also affects growth. And the more a system succeeds through stability, the more likely it is to trust the very things that once made it right. Griswold was admired for its solidity, its durability, its weight in the hand, its careful finishing, a manufacturing standard that was difficult to imitate. But the market does not remain still around those qualities. As modern life began to move faster, as consumer preferences started to shift, as convenience, price, and speed became more important in the choices people made, the very qualities that had once defined Griswold's strength gradually began to act as resistance. At first, the signs looked like only a slight change on the horizon. New materials appeared. New options entered the kitchen. New forms of consumption began to ask for something different from what an earlier generation had once considered ideal. And Griswold at that moment was still a powerful name. It still had reputation, still had quality, still held a deep place in American family life. It was just that the market was preparing to ask a different question. And it was no longer a question of who made better cast iron. The market does not stand still long enough for any standard to keep the same meaning forever. By the middle of the 20th century, the American kitchen was no longer defined only by durability. It was increasingly defined by convenience, speed, weight, price, and by how well an object fit a way of life that was changing very quickly. New materials entered everyday life. New surfaces appeared. Lighter, brighter, easier to clean products better suited to a more modern kitchen began to take more of the market's attention. In a world like that, the value of cookware no longer lay only in how long it could last. It also lay in whether it fit the way people were living now. And that was the point at which Griswold's old strength began to meet a new question. Griswold still had quality, still had reputation, still had a manufacturing standard the market had known for decades. But by then, the market was no longer operating entirely by the logic that had carried Griswold to its peak. It was leaning more toward convenience, toward cost, toward speed of change, and toward the ability to adapt to an increasingly modern consumer life. The problem was not that Griswold suddenly began making inferior products. The problem was that the world around it was beginning to define good in a different way. A system built to produce objects that were solid, heavy in the hand, carefully finished, and able to carry reputation through time, usually does not change direction very quickly. It has its own processes, its own operating rhythm, its own faith in the things it has done right. And because it had been right for so long, it became harder to treat market change as an instruction that required an immediate response. Meanwhile, the household goods industry was shifting in ways that were increasingly clear: larger scale production, a wider range of materials, broader competition, and more choices for the buyer. And when buyers have more choices, the way they judge a product begins to change as well. What once seemed ideal in one period can begin to feel too heavy, too slow, or too elaborate in another. Griswold continued trying to broaden its product line, but broadening a catalog is not the same thing as changing the logic of a system that has been shaped over a very long time. A company can add new products. Changing the operating rhythm that built its reputation is something else entirely, and that was the first crack. After the first crack appeared in the market, the internal structure of Griswold began to change as well. In 1946, after many decades under the control of the founding family, the company was sold to an investment group in New York. By the following year, the Griswold family had left the business entirely. For decades, Griswold had been shaped from within by a manufacturing tradition built on quality, finish consistency, and a reputation accumulated over time. When ownership passed into other hands, the factory in Erie was still there, the workers were still there, the familiar processes were still there, but the system was no longer being guided by the same logic as before. By the 1940s, the company was facing financial difficulty, while also confronting competition from more modern products, internal labor disputes, and signs of declining quality. One layer of pressure built on top of another until the system could no longer hold the stability it once had. In March 1957, McGraw-Edison acquired Griswold. That same year, the housewares division and the Griswold brand were sold again to Wagner Manufacturing in Sydney, Ohio. The chain of transfers happened quickly enough to make one thing clear: the system that had been built in Erie was no longer being treated as a center that needed to keep growing. It was increasingly being treated as a unit that could be separated, moved, and placed inside a different structure. A brand can still survive. A product line can still continue. But the logic that created it in its original birthplace no longer remains intact. In December 1957, the Erie factory closed. When those doors shut, 60 people lost their jobs. That number is not large in the way of a giant industrial collapse, but it is enough to show what this really was: not an empire exploding in a single day, but a system gradually taken apart until the fire in the place that had once made it finally went out. The factory in Erie had stopped, but what was made there remained across the years. Many Griswold pieces still sit in old cabinets in kitchens, in the hands of people who continue to use them as everyday tools. And some of them over time began to take on a second life, the life of objects that are hunted for, collected, and valued more highly with each passing year. A Griswold cast iron skillet pattern number 411 with the slant logo Erie and heat ring sold for $9,750 at an auction in 2025. Many Griswold waffle irons can also reach prices from the hundreds into the thousands. That value does not come from rarity alone. It also comes from something else: the trace of an entire manufacturing era still preserved in the object itself. People can recognize it by hand, by eye, through the experience of using it. The finish, the consistency, the casting skill, the identifying marks, the sense of solidity. These pieces are not just old cookware, they are what remains of a lost manufacturing standard. And perhaps that is what Griswold truly left behind. Not just cast iron kitchenware, but physical proof of a system that once operated well enough for its products to outlive the factory that made them. Griswold no longer exists as a manufacturing empire, but the quality that once built that empire is still the reason the name has not been easily erased by time. Perhaps in the end, what remains is not only a set of old cast iron pans, but the memory of a time that once placed real care into the things it made. And perhaps time does not carry everything away in the same way, but leaves behind the things made with enough care and decency